on this episode of the WildFed podcast.
Starfish, urchins, the corals, sea anemones, jellyfish, sea cucumbers, and octopuses.
The number of people that were like, I want to be a marine biologist when I grow up, but they sort of drop out one by one. You're not only doing that, but you're getting to spend time underwater like that with your students.
It's about the size of a tip of your little finger, but it can stop your heartbeat within a matter of minutes.
Is there coral extinctions taking place, or are corals going to adapt, but this is going to be slow because of the kind of structures that they have to create for themselves?
Fish can learn, but not on the scale that cephalopods, especially the octopus. They have the brain that's right between the eyes, but at the base of each of those 8 arms, there are also a set of brains.
I really love the idea of people eating wild food, but then I have such concerns about the sea and the scale at which it's happening.
We think there's stresses now of overfishing. You add another 20% to the population, that's even going to be worse.
Episode 160 of the WildFed podcast, Corals, Cucumbers, and Jellies, oh my, with Dr. Alan Verde, is brought to you by Surthrival. Why just survive when you can thrive? Surthrival.com is your source for nature-based supplements that keep you thriving in our modern world. From hormone health to immune support, increased metabolism to exercise recovery, Surthrival keeps you thriving when others are merely surviving. Check out their Pine Pollen Pure Potency for testosterone support, colostrum for a smoothie ingredient that's 3 times more effective against flu than vaccines, elk antler for powerful growth and recovery, medicinal mushrooms for immunomodulation and powerful antioxidant capacity, and vitamin D3 for all the protective properties you heard about during the pandemic. Go to surthrival.com to see the entire lineup and use the coupon code WildFed for 5% off your order. Surthrival. Why just survive when you can thrive? Do you need an antidote to the metaverse? We just launched our newest t-shirt design over at wild-fed.com. It features our antidote to the metaverse tagline on the chest, a WildFed badge on the sleeve, and 2 tarot-style cards juxtaposed on the back, one modeled on the tarot card known as the Fool, who's wearing an Oculus and absent-mindedly walking off the roof of a building with a bag of fast food in one hand and a cell phone in the other. Next to it is a card based on the Magician, who's juggling 4 implements, a fishing rod, a rifle, a trap, and a foraging basket. It represents our belief that a life that includes the outdoors inoculates you against believing that an artificial experience of life could ever replace a natural one. You see, for us, being wild-fed, hunting, fishing, and foraging is about a lot more than just getting our groceries. It's an antidote to the metaverse, an act of rebellion against the transhuman agenda that is leading humanity to abandon the natural world in favor of wearing screens over their eyes to live in a virtual one. We choose the natural over the artificial. We choose an antidote to the metaverse. We choose to be fed by the wild. Check out our new shirt at wild-fed.com. I'm Daniel Vitalis, and you're listening to the WildFed podcast, a show about reconnecting with nature through hunting, fishing, foraging, and food. WildFed. Food is all around you. Who doesn't love marine biology? I recently had the opportunity to give a talk at the celebrated Maine Maritime Academy, addressing a class of marine biology and oceanography students. While I was there, I met today's guest, Dr. Alan Verde. Alan is a biologist and diver who specializes in corals, anemones, jellyfish, sea cucumbers, and octopus. Alan, along with the school where he teaches, are training the future generations of young people who will eventually contribute to the stewardship of our seas. It's a big responsibility given the precarious situation we now find ourselves in on planet Earth. Beyond the classroom curriculum, Alan leads multi-week dive trips with his student base to spend time with the organisms they're studying in their natural habitat. It's so important because it's all too easy to study a topic from afar or from an ivory tower, not realizing you only know the thing superficially rather than intimately. But Alan makes sure his students are getting below sea level to interact in ways that are more meaningful than just turning the page in a textbook or turning in a paper. It's why I promote participating in hunting, fishing, and foraging for food. I worry that without an intimate relationship, one that's up close and personal, we'll just slowly forget the organisms we share this planet with. So whenever possible, whether it's through eating like we promote so much here, or it's through biological field work like Alan teaches, I think we need to get hands-on. Once you know a creature, it's hard not to factor their needs into your decision matrix. And that's the kind of experiential knowledge we'll need the policymakers of the future to have. Of course, the biology, physiology, and ecology of the particular organisms that Alan focuses on are fascinating all on their own. So there's plenty to learn here today. The underwater world is so physiologically alien to our own as to make it effectively another world. Yet we do share this planet with these creatures, as well as ultimately a common ancestor. So foreign as they may seem, they are our relations. And while it's important to remember who we share the planet with, it's also easy to forget if we have no contact with them. That's why Alan and I both, in our own ways, recommend you get out there. There's still a whole world populated by incredible and unique organisms just waiting to be remembered and factored in by all of us. All we have to do is go meet them. Alan Verde, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
It's really cool to have you here, man. We just met a couple weeks ago. I got invited to give a talk up there at Maine Maritime where you work. And I wanted to say you came and sat with me and we chatted before my talk. I hadn't done any public speaking for a while, so you're like quite a comfort to me just before I went on. So I want to say thanks for that.
No, you gave a great talk. I had my students write a little summary and a little criticism of the talk, and everybody pretty much said it was very engaging and very dynamic, so very fun to listen to.
I would love to hear some of the criticisms of it. Maybe though first, let's tell folks who you are and what you do.
Okay, my name is Alan Verde. I work in the Ocean Studies Department at Maine Maritime Academy. And I teach classes such as physiology of marine organisms, research methods, and scientific diving. And I also teach several labs in chemistry as well as oceanography.
Your bio on the Maine Maritime website is cool because you say sort of like, I think I have the best job here.
Oh, I do.
I was thinking about
I do.
Why do you say that?
Well, I get to interact with students a little bit more differently, I think, than most other faculty. I invite students to go out to the West Coast every summer, unless I'm working overseas someplace. But pretty much every summer I head out to Washington State because I essentially came from there, from the Pacific Northwest, before I started working at MMA in 2004. And so I have colleagues there and I have research projects there that I've kept going. And those projects involve sea anemones, sea cucumbers, and octopuses. And so I invite students from here to go over there and work and help with the diving and the collecting of data for 2 to 3 months. And then so I get to really know these students very well. And then they get to know me because we have a lot of fun, as well as we get to tease each other and laugh at each other that we really usually don't do or get to do at a formal setting in a classroom.
Yeah,
setting.
in the field work. So the students are diving as well?
Correct. They have to be divers,
that's cool.
And that's a requirement because otherwise they're just sitting on the shoreline watching somebody else have all the fun of collecting animals and bringing them up. That was part of why I have the best job overall, and I get to dive for my job. So I started diving when I was in high school, and I've used it. I made my first $1,200 on diving by going up to Alaska during the summers when I was a college student, and I was fishing up there for salmon, and I actually got hired by the captain they were recruiting at the college. And once they found out that I was a diver and that I had all my gear, they hired me on the spot. And that summer, I actually used it because there was another fishing vessel that was nearby. This was up in Southeast Alaska. And they wrapped their net around the prop. And so they were not fishing, obviously. And so they made a call out to other boats to see if there were any local divers. And so we exchanged crew. I went over to their boat with my gear, and somebody from their crew came over to our boat and took over my job so that our boat could keep fishing. And then I went underneath and started trying to remove the net out of the prop. But all said, I wasn't able to because I ran out of air.
Pretty serious entanglement, huh?
Yes, very. And so, I came up, and a couple of weeks later, I got my check for $1,200, even though I didn't finish the job. So diving has been, a very big part of my career. And I've, helped and pushed students to say, if you really want to get involved with marine bio, that particular major, as opposed to oceanography or coastal marine environmental science, which are the other two majors in our department, you should really think about taking up scuba diving, because it
seems pretty essential, actually.
Yeah, it's you get to see the animals in their environment, right, as opposed to an aquarium or watching it on TV.
Right. Yeah, there's all that lore around, like, let's say the Navy SEALs, where it's like, this many guys sign up every year for buds and they go, and then like this is the graduating class. It's just a fraction, I don't know what it is, 10% or something make it through that. And I was thinking about growing up, the number of people that were like, I want to be a marine biologist when I grow up. And then how many people really do it. So you've kind of pursued a path that, I just hear so many people say they would like to do that, but they sort of drop out one by one. And to make it to a place where, you're not only doing that, but you're getting to spend time underwater like that with your students and everything seems kind of like a dream. So that's really amazing.
Yeah. And that's, I teach subject matter that I thoroughly enjoy. I haven't woken up since working at MMA and dreaded going to work. And so I'm pretty happy with my job. Some of the times the students, they're a little bit interesting to work with, in that some of them aren't doing very well, or some of them do something that they're not supposed to. For instance, they might plagiarize or cheat, and when you call them on it, that's the tough part of being an educator, is that you gotta say, what you did was wrong, and here are the consequences, and then have them lick their wounds and have them keep going.
Man, I wouldn't even have thought about that. It's a really unique school. Getting to see the campus. I've heard, living in Maine, you hear about the school all the time, but I had, I'd been up to interview one of your faculty once, and now I realize I had just been on the outskirts of the campus. But having gone through and seen, the campus, the student body, and actually the ships too that you guys have in the harbor there, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about the school, because it's such a unique operation from what I see, at least here in the Northeast.
Yeah, well, the school got started in the early part of World War II because they needed mariners to supply all the ships that were crossing the Atlantic for the war in Europe, and also the Pacific War with Japan. And so they started the school to train mariners, specifically crew and captains and engineers, in order to supply these vessels that were needed to bring over war supplies. And so the school was originally built for engineering department and the vessel operations technology department, which is the deck, the crew, the captains, the officers, as opposed to the engineers that are primarily down in the engine room taking care of the machinery. And then we also have international business and logistics, which takes care of business side of things, and the logistics side of moving stuff from China onto a container, onto a ship, crossing the Pacific, being offloaded in LAX, and then put on a truck to be shipped to a Walmart in Maine. So it's all that, all that tracking of that material that needs to be done. And then we
Are
have
these folks merchant marines? Is that what that term?
Yes.
I'm going to hear that.
Yes.
I've just never really known what that was.
That's correct. So the students that come out with their engineering and also with their vessel operations technology, those are the captains and the officers. When they get hired on, then they are merchant marines. Yes.
Okay.
Merchant mariners.
Yeah, and I saw the ships in harbor there, but so that side of the school is focused on putting out these merchant marines, but then there's this whole other aspect of the school, which is the marine biology, oceanography, ecology side too. Is that fair to say?
It is the marine biology. So our department has three majors. The oldest one is oceanography, and then about 2002, the oceanography department at that time decided they wanted to diversify and start a marine biology program. And that's part of the reason I was hired, is because they wanted more people, more faculty involved with the budding marine biology program at that time. And then just about 3 years ago, we started our newest program, which is the Coastal and Marine Environmental Science. So it's a little bit different from your typical environmental science degree in that we're looking at both the near shore and onshore interactions and the human impacts and that sort of thing. For that,
what does that mean, like in real terms for people listening, like in real life?
Those students look at how humans modify, change, utilize, use resources in the nearshore area. So, for instance, there's a big push right now for offshore wind development, right? And so there's impacts involved with that in terms of workforce, and also in terms of impacts to the environment, whatever that will be. And so you document that, and they look at that and say, okay, it's better to put it at this location than on that location.
Okay. Tell me about your specific field of interest and what you're focused on. I just reading your bio, I picked up a new word, Cnidarian, which I struggled to pronounce till I looked that up as well. This is a category of animal that I've never seen that term before. So anyway, I'm curious, how you got interested in the group of species you look at. Like, what are they? How'd you get interested in that? And like, sort of, what's your work around them?
Okay. The Cnidarians are a group of animals that consist of the corals in the tropics and anemones, sea anemones, jellyfish. And they are called Cnidarians because they have a specific kind of cell that is found in this group of animals called the cnidae. And essentially, it is the harpoon cell that goes out and stings things and poisons them and injects a toxin into the animal so that it stuns them, and then they can't breathe anymore, or whatever the case may be, and then they're brought into the mouth of this Cnidarian. So corals, sea anemones, jellyfish are the three main. There's hydroids as well, but those are the three main types of animals that probably people are familiar with. And so I was,
knowing very little about them, I would have assumed that sting came from a multicellular tissue kind of anatomical structure, not from an individual cell. So that's actually a cellular function, that sting.
Yes.
It's not something that happens from a from a larger tissue conglomeration?
Correct. They're individual cells. So
Wow.
another term for these cnidae are nematocysts. And you can think of it as a capsule, a rectangular tubular capsule, and inside there's this coil of wire, and at the end of that coil of wire is this harpoon, because it literally looks like a harpoon with a sac. And so there's a little trigger that if that trigger is brushed up against by a prey item or an animal or your skin, then it fires this harpoon into whatever triggered it. So if you're a soft-bodied organism, and you're small, you're essentially toast. But if you're a big one, like humans, you feel the sting, and sometimes it's really pretty nasty, and sometimes it can be life-threatening, depending on what kind of cnidarian hits you, so to speak. So, for instance, most people have heard, at least in the tropics, about the man o' war.
Mm-hmm.
And that has some nasty stings that could potentially kill you. And then the nastiest one in the world is called the box jellyfish. And it's about the size of a tip of your little finger. They're small, but they have the nastiest sting, and it's a neurotoxin. And so it can stop your breathing, stop your heartbeat within a matter of minutes.
Wow. And I'm looking at some wounds right now that people have sustained, and they're pretty bad. Just even what it does to the skin, huh?
Yeah, I mean, it bubbles up, and so it's your life expectancy if you touch one of these cubomedusa are 30 minutes to an hour.
And where are they?
Well, they're primarily in the tropics, so
all right, glad to hear that.
Yeah, you don't find them up here in the Gulf of Maine because the water's too cold. They won't survive it. So you're looking at where it's warmer, so Georgia on down into the Caribbean for the man o' war, and then out in the Pacific, Australia, southern Philippines, in that area for the box jellyfish. Primarily
when I'm in Florida and I see those, it sometimes will look like a sort of blue purple inflated condom.
Yes,
the man o' war, right?
That is the man o' war, correct? That is the float. It's got gas that it puts in there, so it allows it to float around via the wind, and then its tentacles are kind of just drifting behind it and catching things as it drifts along.
Do they get separated? Because I often see that float part, but with apparently nothing attached to it.
Yeah, the tentacles are pretty fragile, and so yes, they can break off pretty easily if there's lots of wave action, crashing waves. Okay. But if it's fairly calm, then you can see those tentacles pretty easily. But yes, they can break off very easily as well. These animals are only 2 cell layers thick. There's
oh, cool.
So
okay.
They're very gelatinous. There's no hard bones or structures or exoskeleton like a crab to keep it together.
These cells you've been describing that contain that harpoon-like structure. 2 questions about that. The first is, it sounds like it's sort of just passively activated. It's not like the animal determines that it wants to trigger that. So that's my first question. And secondly will be, is the cell destroyed in this process, or can this thing be like reloaded? Or is that the end of that particular cell's, lifespan?
Okay. First question, is it passive or active? It is strictly passive. Okay. It has to be, the trigger has to be touched by something before it fires.
Does it ever sting itself then, like with its own tentacles, or like?
I suppose it could.
Other jellies? Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose it could if it wraps around, the tentacles wrap around themselves or something. Yeah. So theoretically, yes. The second question is can you regenerate or reuse or repack these cells? Is no. That once they fire, that's it. They're done. They just have to generate new cells over time.
Wow, that's fascinating. And what's the propulsion mechanism for jellies? When I see them moving through the water, are those muscular fibers that they're using? Because you sort of see that pulse of contraction that they have.
Right. They do have, between the two cell layers, there's this stuff called mesoglia, and it's very elastic. Not quite as elastic as, say, tendon, but along those lines. And then you have these contractile cells that do contract and bend this mesoglia. And then when those cells relax, then the mesoglia kind of rebounds. And so that's the pulsing that you see when you see jellyfish are swimming around in the water.
Yeah, it's mesmerizing to watch them. I've heard things like sometimes people. I've got a sort of a light interest in the mola, the ocean sunfish.
Mm-hmm.
And people get a little disturbed when I say this, but I'm fascinated by the idea of eating one. And I always hear that they are like specialist feeders on jellyfish, and so I'm curious if that's true. And then also, like, what else is predating upon jellyfish?
Okay.
And do they have much food value?
I don't know anything about the diet of molas, so I can't answer that question. But molas tend to be up in the surface, and that's where the jellyfish tend to be up in the surface, because that's where the zooplankton are. They're catching the zooplankton that happens to swim into their tentacles. In terms of other organisms that eat jellyfish, turtles are a big fan of jellyfish, and that's a problem when you have.
They must be quite protected from their from those cells then too.
Yeah, their mouth apparently is pretty leathery enough, tough enough, so that the nematocysts don't penetrate. They don't have any issues with that, and that's a problem. That these jellyfish look like, or plastic floating around looks like these jellyfish.
Yeah.
And so the turtle starts biting on it and starts swallowing it, and then it plugs up their digestive tract. And
it's a Walmart shopping bag that masquerading as a jellyfish.
Right, because as it's floating around, it moves like a jellyfish, and so it's a slow demise of the turtle when their digestive system is plugged. So essentially they're starving to death if they ingest enough of this stuff.
What about, I'm curious, just sort of bookending the large and small side of jellyfish. Like what are how small do the species get? And then what are the larger species like? How big do they get?
Well, small is, it all depends. They can be super small, microscopic, in that their life stages when they are just barely developing are super small. But they're, and then they just grow to become larger jellyfish, so to speak. And so they start their life cycle in the plankton and zooplankton, microscopic. You can only see them in a microscope at 100x.
Yeah.
And then, they just get
looking
larger
like
and larger.
They do as adults.
Yeah, they eventually will grow to look exactly like the adults. Now, so they don't have this metamorphosis stage like crabs, where when the crabs first hatch, they look far different from what the adult is going to look like, or the lobster, so to speak. But these cnidarians are pretty much, at least for jellyfish, once they form the young, then it just grows and grows.
What would
the
be
largest one? The largest ones that I've seen is probably about 3.5, 4 feet across.
Wow.
I saw this up in Alaska, and there's a lot of jellyfish up in Alaska. I spent 2 summers fishing up there as a college student, seining on the salmon boats, and those nets would catch a lot of jellyfish and as they're sweeping for salmon, and we would get rained on by jellyfish all the time. So
from the
never
nets.
wanted to look up. So.
Yeah, right. I bet. Is there been a place like for, have you ever seen jellyfish in, I guess in like mythology? I haven't really seen that,
No.
obviously, I mean, indigenous folks would have been interacting with them at some level, right? I mean, I see them in the inshore environment a lot of times, just, being on my boat or something, I'll see one go by. So it's not like they were unknown to people who lived in coastal environments, right?
Yeah. No, I'm not aware of any kind of mythological creatures that were highlighted. There probably
interesting
is,
because they're such bizarre creatures to look at.
Yeah. I mean, possibly the closest would be Hydra, right? And Hydra is actually a genus of one of the Cnidarians, and Hydra in Greek mythology had hair that were snakes, and so that resembles the tentacles that are waving around that are nasty if you get hit by this. So that's the closest thing.
Okay, but almost like the anemone are related. They're also Cnidarians.
Yes. So anemones are related to jellyfish, and then corals are they look very similar to anemones. Corals are just colonial anemones, so to speak. So anemone is usually solitary.
Oh, okay, yeah. Okay.
And then, but if you put a bunch of them together or clone them, then that's essentially what a coral is, because it has multiple polyps that's part of this organism. So they all share the same stomach, so to speak, because one can feed to the other and share the food.
Oh, no kidding.
But they're
so when I see like a large coral structure,
mm-hmm.
In a large coral structure, can it move nutrients around that entire structure?
Yeah.
Oh, no way. Yeah, this is like, it was several years ago. I remember I first, I guess I didn't think coral were, botanical or something like that. I just had never thought about them as animals. I was watching a documentary and it was like, oh yeah, I guess they're animals. I hadn't really considered that before. That was kind of like a shock to me. I don't know what I thought they were. I just hadn't really thought about it at all. But is the situation with coral, by the way, this is this thing that you see a lot in pop media now, is this idea that this idea of coral bleaching and coral as sort of an indicator species for, I guess, climate and or chemical, I guess, acid-base changes in pH changes in the water.
Right.
Is the situation with coral as dire as sort of is portrayed in the media right now, or is this hype? What's going on? We'll get right back to the show in a moment, but first, I've got some good news about the WildFed TV show. You can now stream both seasons 1 and 2 on demand at myoutdoortv.com. That's myoutdoortv.com. My Outdoor TV is Outdoor Channel's premium online subscription service. They host thousands of episodes of hunting and fishing content, making this a great subscription service for anyone interested in the outdoors. But if you just want to see WildFed, grab yourself a free trial subscription and then check out all 20 episodes at no charge at all. If you decide to keep it, it's just $9.99 a month. We're currently in production for season 3 of WildFed, which should start airing around the beginning of 2023. Hey, thanks again for all your incredible support. If you haven't already, I can't wait for you to see the show.
I don't think it's hype. I started diving, back in the late 70s when I was in high school, and I've dove around different parts of the world, and when I first started diving, for instance, when I first started diving in Florida, I went to the Middle Keys and Marathon, then the Key West, and then also up in Key Largo. And this was late 70s, early 80s. And my recollection of the corals there were phenomenal. And then I went back there over the course of the years since, and it's just gotten worse and worse. And essentially, the corals are being loved to death, right? Once you turn an area into a underwater park, then essentially it gets loved to death. And there's just a lot of people in the water, and they're not supposed to touch, but inadvertently, you'll touch or you'll kick something and it breaks something off.
That's for everybody else. It's okay if I do it.
Yeah, or you're peeing in the water, right? That's a lot of nitrogen that you're putting in that area. Although it's diluted because the water's moving around, but still, it's over the course of years and years of that kind of stuff.
Are they filter feeding the corals?
They are capturing zooplankton by using those nematocysts, those nidare cells.
Oh, right. Okay, so similar. They're sort of emerging from that. Is it like a calcareous structure? What is that structure that they make?
Correct. It's their calcium carbonate skeleton, and it's white. And that's what you see when you see a bleached coral, is the white calcium carbonate underneath them. Typically, they're some sort of brownish color with some others, blues, greens, oranges here and there. But it's typically a brown. And that's because they have algae inside of them, intracellularly. So inside a cell of these corals, there is another cell, and that cell is a dinoflagellate. And they're called collectively zooxanthellae. And so those zooxanthellae will take sunlight and photosynthesize, take the CO2 that the animal cell is giving off, as well as CO2 from the seawater. It will incorporate that using sunlight via photosynthesis into organic molecules, and then use it to feed itself, to grow. But there's extra, lots and lots of extra. And so it actually excretes those organic products to the animal cell, which then the animal cell uses those organic products to grow and produce whatever it needs to.
In addition to the feeding that it's doing on zooplankton, it's also deriving energy from those dinoflagella. So that's fascinating because, okay, wow. So that color that we see is the product of that endosymbiosis with this other organism?
Correct. The brownish color that you see is actually the chlorophyll of the dinoflagellates.
Okay. But the bright colors we see in corals, that's the corals themselves? Or?
Yeah, that's probably animal pigmentation, because if you remove those colors, those brighter colors, then it would just be this browner color because of the chlorophyll. That's the light hits it, it's a brown color.
Yeah, thinking back to the first time it was probably about 20 years ago, the first time I did any like sort of snorkeling around Key West. And I just remember even at that time being mesmerized by it. It's like kaleidoscopic under there. And in the last few years going back, I mean, it kind of looks like a busted up concrete, like lot or something. I mean, just almost no color. Everything looks kind of broken. Just, I'd have gone to a couple of areas that are preserves where it's a little more interesting, but I've always wondered, is that a snapshot of what the world is like, or is that just what Florida has become like? So do you think that speaks to a larger scale issue? It's not just something that's happening in the Keys there.
Yeah, it's occurring worldwide, where you have easy access to these reefs. And where you don't have access, then they're obviously doing much better because there are no humans. There are very little humans there. For instance, I've gone on several liveaboards for diving for anywhere from a week to 10 days. In Australia, the Great Barrier Reef, which is a 24-hour run from Cairns to where you start diving. So it's way, offshore. And then Solomon Islands, there's places there where, nobody ever goes unless you have a boat. And so these areas that have minimal humans are doing really well, whereas those close to larger areas of population, yeah, not doing so well. Just because, like I said, they're being loved to death. People want to go visit and see, and there's a cost involved with that.
But that's the issue, though. So
The
I guess why I'm bringing this up. Okay.
Is getting worse and worse because the temperature of the world is climbing slowly, right?
Okay.
Because of
That's what I was wondering.
climate change. And these corals, they need the sunlight because they have the dinoflagellates in them. So they have to be up near the surface for that sunlight to penetrate, because sunlight doesn't go very deep. It gets extinguished fairly quickly. So most corals are in the 40, 50, 60 foot range. I mean, there's some deeper, but it gets less and less. And so 50, 60 feet or less is where you find these corals, because they need that sunlight to do their thing, to get the food from the dinoflagellates. And it's been estimated that anywhere from 85 to 90% or more of the organic products that is obtained by the coral is actually from the zooxanthellae, because there's millions and millions of these zooxanthellae within the coral, and they just supplement their diet with zooplankton that happens to come by and get caught in their tentacles. So the bleaching is the expulsion of the dinoflagellates from the tissues of the coral or the anemone.
Oh, okay.
And that happens primarily when they're stressed. And the biggest stressor is temperature, because where you find these vast coral reefs are in the tropics, and the water is already warm. And then you're close to the surface because you need the sunlight, and the surface of the water is that much warmer. And so these corals are living right on the upper thermal limit of their capability.
Oh, yeah.
They're pushing the envelope of where they can survive
already.
And so if the temperature goes up just a degree or two for any length of time, say a week, then that thermal stress really does a number on that association. The algae don't like it, and the animal doesn't like it. And nobody really knows who initiates the process of bleaching, the expulsion of the zooxanthellae. Nobody knows whether the algae initiates that process or it's the animal itself that initiates the process of kicking out the algae. But regardless, you have loss of significant amounts. Probably 99.9% of the algae can be lost. And if those algae don't come back, then the animal essentially is starving itself. And so it's more susceptible to disease from bacteria, viruses. And so, yeah, it's a precarious state that corals are in when they are bleached. Now, that said, there's also this idea that, okay, if you bleach because there's thermal stress or UV stress or freshwater stress or sediment stress, whatever the case may be, and you get rid of this population of zooxanthellae that can't handle it, then you can get seeded. If you survive long enough, you can get reseeded by other dinoflagellate that are free swimming around in the water column. They'll enter the anemone through the mouth of the coral, of the anemone and coral, and then enter the cell. And then repopulate eventually the coral or the anemone with a different strain of zooxanthellae that has a higher thermal tolerance. And so if that coral is exposed to elevated temperatures again, then it says, I don't need to bleach because I have the thermal ability to handle these slightly higher temperatures. Neat. So they sort of pre-adapt themselves by undergoing this initial bleaching, but then possibly reacquiring a different strain of zooxanthellae back into their tissues that can handle the higher thermal stress. and
Well,
so
that's
they can
good news.
survive
I've wondered a
the
lot about
next
this because
round of temperature increases.
the Earth has
But
obviously been through so
yeah,
many.
bleaching can be massive on a large scale area. And that's shown to happen, especially in the Great Barrier Reef, where they document bleaching by flying over in airplanes. Or you can have, in an individual coral, you can have parts of it bleach, but the rest of it is healthy. And so, that's micro bleaching versus macro bleaching, where you have large tracts.
The Earth has been through such dramatic climate changes over the course of its own history. I imagine corals have been with us a really long time. So this makes me think it's more a function of where they are in the water column that's allowed them to survive at different times in different climates, because it sounds like it's, if they're too shallow, the water can be too warm for them. So have they just had to shift around slowly? And is the problem how quickly the climate is changing? I mean, I just imagine they've been through this before, different climatic changes we've had.
Yes, yes. But it's the rate of change that's really a
Mm-hmm.
problem, right?
Right.
If you change temperature and increase over the span of 100,000 years,
Yeah,
organisms can
plenty of time.
adapt to
Right.
that. But if you change it in a matter of 100 years, that order of magnitude is unprecedented for these animals, and so they
Right.
cannot adapt fast enough. There are animals that can, but others that cannot, and so it's a matter of survival to those that
Uh,
cannot.
what is your consensus? Like the are corals at, again, like I've seen like some shock documentaries, so it's like I'm not really sure what's real here, but um, are they at significant risk? Are we like losing corals in a significant and catastrophic way? Is there coral extinctions taking place, or are corals going to adapt, but this is going to be slow because of the kind of structures that they have to create for themselves and their ability to move around? And to what degree are some of the um, I've seen humans sort of, I don't know what you call it, seeding, I guess maybe. Is human seeding of coral going to be really important to this whole process of keeping corals with us? I mean, where are we really at with all that?
Well, it's it's a worldwide problem in that most of the corals are right around the tropics because they like warm water and they like lots of sun, and that's where you have them. Now, corals are incredibly diverse in terms of their number of organisms and the species that are there. They're the rainforest, so to speak, of the underwater world. There's so many things that
Yeah.
depend on them. Right? There's so much being extracted from them for human use in terms of fish and that sort of thing. And the seeding part is one of several kinds of options that can be done. It's like out west where they clear cut pine trees for the lumber industry, but then you come back and start seeding pine trees again. And so that every 60 years or so, you can cut it down again, or 100 years. So that's the idea behind the seeding, is that you take areas that have been destroyed either via a grounding of a vessel, and then you plant corals again. The problem, though, is if you don't take care of the root problem,
Mm-hmm.
then putting fragments of corals back there is a slow. It may work, it may not work, because if you don't take care of the increasing temperature, then you're not really addressing the issue, and so
Right.
you're maybe delaying the inevitable. But you got to do something to help.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
um, and the corals that are deeper water, because they're colder, they're buffered from thermal stress that's occurring in the close to the surface, and so it's thought that the corals down in the deeper water will if the thermal stress is alleviated, will start slowly seeding via natural means by reproduction the shallower surface. Or people have taken corals that are in much warmer areas or are growing in areas that are warmer and then putting them into other places that have died. So that those have a higher chance of survival. So for instance, corals in the Red Sea is a slightly higher temperature than the rest of the Pacific. And so there are corals there that are being used to propagate in other areas of the Pacific.
Well, is a coral sedentary its whole life, and then how does it? And same question for an anemone. Does an anemone have the ability to move around and migrate, or is it always sedentary? And then how do these organisms reproduce and colonize new areas if they are sedentary?
Okay, anemones can move around very slowly, but they can move. So you can actually peel them off a rock cool. and then put them into a flow-through tank, and then they'll move around pretty easily. Wow. Very slow, but over the course of several days, you can see where they move.
They can walk, or what?
They kind of just slide.
Yeah, inch along. Okay.
Yeah. They kind of just slide around. Cool. Corals, however, the stony corals, they can't move. They're locked in stone, so to speak. Once they find a spot to undergo metamorphosis, then they are stuck there because they're growing their skeleton, and so they are permanently attached. Whereas anemones can move around.
How do they get to a new area? So how does a coral colonize a new area?
Well, it's all due to reproduction. So these guys, they have males and females, separate organisms. And most of the time, there are also some hermaphrodites that have both. But in general, most of corals have either males or females. And so they broadcast spawn. So the sperm is released up in the water column, the eggs are released up in the water column, and it's just all coordinated. It's like 10 days after a full moon in the summertime is when these guys will do their thing. And so all that sperm and eggs is mixed in the water column, and then you have fertilization taking place, and then those fertilized eggs are moved around by water currents and wind and tides. And then as they develop, they're still moved around by water, and then there's a certain time when they say, okay, it's time to undergo metamorphosis, and they'll sink down to the bottom, and then they'll chemosensory-wise look around, feel around, taste around until they think something is adequate that will allow them to survive, and then they'll cement themselves and start growing a calcium carbonate skeleton.
So they have like a flagellum at that point or something? They can navigate around a little bit?
Yeah, the larval stages, they have flagella, so they can dry themselves. But they're not very strong swimmers, right? I mean, any kind of water motion, and they're going to be pushed around. But if the water is completely still, they have the ability to swim around.
Wow, that's really neat. Now, tell me, how does a sea cucumber relate to any of these organisms, or does it? I watch the way it feeds, and it's like it kind of does that reach out too.
Yeah, sea cucumbers are a different phyla. So cnidarians are a group of animals underneath the phylum Cnidaria. So corals, jellyfish, anemones are under cnidarians. You have sponges that under the phylum Porifera. And so you have sea cucumbers, starfish, urchins. Those fall underneath the phylum group of animals called echinoderms, or spiny skin. Echinodermata means spiny skin. And sea cucumbers, they're soft. They don't have a hard skeleton like urchins do, sea urchins that have a test, so you can pick them up and they don't squish very much. But sea cucumbers are primarily just using the water as a as a hydraulic system to move and feed. And so these guys will put out their tentacles, and some of them are filter feeders, so they just push it out, and then they'll catch whatever zooplankton happens to come across, and then pull that in. And then there are others that are feeding on the bottom, picking up bits and pieces of stuff and putting it in their mouth. And then there are deposit feeders, so they'll actually eat the sediment and digest the organics and the bacteria that are on those sediments, and then poop out this string of sand, clean sand, so to speak.
Oh, wow.
So
yeah, they've been popularized as a bit of a wild food resource by the guys over at the show Meat Eater, and I've seen them, opening sea cucumbers up and pulling out what look like sort of 5 strings of muscle. They sort of scrape out with like a paint scraper and eat that. Have they been a food resource for a long time? Is that something like traditional that they've been used that way?
Yeah, the Asians have been eating sea cucumbers for a long time, and that's where the main market is. And so I was in Lubeck several years ago visiting a sea cucumber processing facility where they would have their collectors come in, deposit, and then they would process these guys and take out the bands, the muscle bands, and then they would also use the skin. I don't know exactly for what, but then it's all shipped over to Asia. Now, I have eaten sea cucumbers in Japan. I was over there traveling, and there were some sea cucumbers in the grocery store, and there was a family that invited me to have dinner, and they had sea cucumbers, and actually I was able to help process them and put it with some wasabi and some soy sauce and eat it raw. So it was kind of crunchy.
Really?
Nothing
crunchy raw.
Yeah, the skin, at least for that particular sea cucumber, was kind of crunchy, and didn't really have any taste, but it's there. And I've also eaten jellyfish in soups.
Oh, I would really like to hear about that. First though, can I just ask with the sea cucumbers, because I'm very interested in eating jellyfish. With the sea cucumber, are they being overfished? Is this a sustainable fishery at this point? Or are there, I imagine there's so many species too, so I imagine it varies, but are there any issues with overfishing that you're aware of with sea cucumbers?
Not in the U.S. In other parts of the world, there is. In the eastern part of Africa, it's being collected heavily.
Okay.
Because just of the monetary amounts involved there. And so, yes, they're heavily harvested and overfished in Eastern Africa, or not Eastern Africa, Western Africa. And here in the U.S., in the East Coast, not so much. And then also on the West Coast, there's also sea cucumber that's heavily harvested there, but the population is not anywhere close to being threatened.
Okay, so that's good to know for folks listening who might want to get involved in that fishery, to at least recreationally, to know that it's still a sustainable fishery here. Tell me about eating jellyfish. I'm super curious about that.
Well, I had it in soup, and so it was at a restaurant. This was in Hong Kong. I spent a month working in Hong Kong several years ago, and so I was brought to this restaurant by a family that had befriended me and actually sponsored me to work in Hong Kong. And they said, you have to try this because it has jellyfish in it. And I asked them, so how do they process the jellyfish? And apparently it is dried, so it's mostly water. Jellyfish is probably 90 to 95% water. And so you dry this thing.
2 cell layers thick, you said.
Yeah, you dry this thing, and then you just cut it up and use it in soups. So it doesn't really have any flavoring. It's more...
Yeah.
But I don't know what else to
say. More of a textural element, I guess.
Yeah, and it was not crunchy. It was very kind of like noodles, right?
Yeah, that's what
noodles.
I'm picturing, like a really hydrated rice noodle is what I picture, or something like that.
Right, exactly. So the flavoring was from whatever they put in there, and there was really no taste of the jellyfish itself.
Having, personally having never been over to China, one thing I just, everybody tells me who has visited is like, man, they eat sort of just about everything there. And just like, almost like I get this sense of an excitement about eating the most bizarre things culturally. And I just like, I'm like that. So I'm always finding that fascinating.
Yeah, it's very um, eye-opening to Westerners what the Asian community will eat. Anything that has
Yeah.
eyes, fur, and moves essentially is fair game.
Yeah.
For
Or
instance,
tentacles. Yeah.
yeah, for instance, I think this was during high school, maybe my early years of college. I was brought by my aunt to Taiwan because she was teaching piano there for about a week. And so she invited me, and I went because I'd never been to Taiwan. And so our host family uh, took me to this place called the Snake Market, and
Wow.
it was just this street, and both sides you had every animal you could think of. I mean, there were turtles that had their heads cut off and they're upside down, stacked, and so the legs and the tails are kind of wiggling. But you pick one and cook it. There were monkeys, there were birds, there were
Whoa.
stacks and stacks of lizards. So if you can imagine a lizard that has been staked out on a bamboo cross and dried, and there's just stacks of these leaning,
How big of a lizard are we talking?
uh, probably 8-10 inches,
Yeah.
the body, and then the tail is longer. And so it looks like people are leafing through these things, flipping through these things like you would an art kind of thing.
Records or something.
Yeah, records, exactly. And then they see something they like, they'll pull it out and give it to the person behind, and that person behind the counter goes back, and then you hear this grinding noise. And they come back with this little bag of ground up lizard. And then what do you do with that?
Oh.
Do you take it home and use it for medicine, or do you put it in your soup? So, and then we went to a place called the Snake. Well, it's called the Snake Market because their premier show, so to speak, was they had these snakes and they claimed they're poisonous because they will show that they milk the fangs into the shot glass, and then they'll put this shot glass with supposed venom in, and they'll add in some sort of alcohol, and then they'll clamp the head of the snake, and then they'll hold the tail and they'll run scissors from the anus all the way up to the head. So this snake is swiggling, it's still alive. And then they'll open up where the heart is, and then they'll clamp the arteries and cut it, and then drain the blood into a tumbler, tall glass, kind of like a mug, a bigger mug, a beer stein sized thing. And then, so it's red, and then they'll add in another alcohol to fill it up. And then, so the snake is obviously dead by that time. And then they'll open up and find the gallbladder, and then they'll open that into another shot glass and add in a different kind of alcohol. Then they'll mix all three of these concoctions together. That's the drink. And then they'll bring you out the soup and rice that has snake meat in it. And that's the meal. And there's plenty of signs that say no photography or video allowed. So people can watch, but you can't. You're not allowed to record it. And so,
I'm so fascinated being alien to this, because it's so bizarre looking from the outside in, but that's just the nature of being alien to something. But, I used to go to Chinatown up in Montreal, and it'd be just barrels of seahorses and barrels of sea dragons. And I remember my wife one time getting some traditional medicine made, and boy, she was choking it down, but not liking this tea that she had to drink. And eventually we found out it had human placenta in it, which was like, wait, how are you even commercially
getting that?
acquiring? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for letting us know. Anyway, I wanted to ask you, this is kind of a quick digression, but we're running out of time. And I wanted to check in about one more kind of pop culture thing that I've been hearing so much about, and that is about cephalopods, in particular octopus, and the intelligence of them. And I'm wondering if this is, I again want to ask you kind of that same question. Is this thing is this true? Is this where the research is going, or is this kind of being overstated? And is it hyperbole, or are we learning that octopus and have a kind of intelligence that's a little bit different than what we see throughout the animal kingdom?
Yeah, I mean they are bar none the most intelligent of the invertebrates, and they're actually more intelligent than fish. Fish can learn, but not on the scale that cephalopods, especially the octopus, can learn and have memory, because they recognize you. Because when I go out to Washington, we have the potential of working with 3 different species there. There's a giant Pacific octopus. There's the ruby octopus, which is the size of your hand. And then there's moose octopus, which is the body is the size of your thumb. So different sizes. But we work with the red octopus, the ruby octopus, Octopus rubescens, a lot more than the other 2, because we can acquire them easily enough, consistently. And we bring them into the lab and we do behavioral studies on them. We also do ocean acidification studies on them, and how that affects their sensory perception of, and how does that then change their physiology, and or how does that exposure to lower pH affect their ability to prey or find food and handle it, and that sort of thing. And their intelligence is amazing. Some of them, they have personalities. Some of them are very shy. So even over the course of 2 months that we're feeding them every 2 or 3 days, they won't have anything to do with us. They'll go and stay at the bottom of their tank, or they'll be in their red bottle. Others are really precarious. And so as soon as you open the lid, they'll come right up and they'll start sticking a tentacle, an arm out, and you touch them and they'll hold on to you. And they're amazing animals. Now, they're the only creature, they have a completely different nervous system than any other animal, because they have the brain that's right between the eyes, but at the base of each of those 8 arms, there are also a set of brains that work independent of each other. So you have the central brain between the eyes, but you also have these 8 other brains that can independently control those 8 different arms, and they're all communicating with each other. And so, when you have essentially 9 brains, that who knows what you can do in terms of processing of information. So,
wow, that's fascinating. And then this group of the cephalopods, what are they most closely related to? They just seem like this weird offshoot. Like, what's the phylogeny, I guess? Like,
well,
they fall
in the phylum Mollusca. And so the cephalopods are a class, Cephalopoda. And so they're related to sea slugs. They're related to gastropods, the periwinkles that you see in the shoreline here.
Yeah.
They're related to bivalves. Bivalves are mollusks.
Yeah.
And so I would probably argue that the bivalves are probably one of the dumbest invertebrates, but in the same phyla with the smartest invertebrate. Yeah. How does that happen?
Sure. Yeah. Oh, man. Well, it happens in families sometimes. You see that. Yeah. We'll all be seeing that at Christmas time. You get the real smart ones and the not so smart ones. Do you, after working with them, do you eat octopus?
I used to eat a lot more, not as much anymore. Just because, yeah, they're just so highly intelligent. And Britain actually has recently, probably the last 6 months to a year, has classified them as sentient beings. And so
Interesting.
I've cut down on my eating of octopus. The first time I ever tasted octopus, I was in Hawaii, my sophomore year in undergraduate school. I transferred from Washington to Hawaii there for a year. And I was working at a copy center during Christmas break, and the guy that got me the job came in one day and said, "You got to try this, but you have to have your eyes closed and you can't see what it is." So, I picked it up, put it in my mouth, ate it, and I said, "Wow, this is really good." And I had some more. And then he told me it was octopus. And yeah, that was the best tasting octopus that I remember. And I've had, I've had
They're
octopus.
big on it in Hawaii, huh?
Yeah, I mean, I've had octopus in sushi, obviously, because that's where you eat it a lot. But yeah, I've sort of slowly moved away from eating octopus. Now, there's plans of having octopus farms where they grow octopus instead of catching it in the wild. They grow them up, but there's issues with that too, because this is a very intelligent organism, and you're pigeonholing them into a small little cubicle, and then they're predators. You have to feed them something that's alive.
Yeah.
You can't feed them pellets like you can a fish. And so the cost of getting a live crabs, which is their favorite food, is, it's, yeah.
Wow, that's really interesting. The idea of raising them in farms, but then we do that with, let's say, hogs, which are, I would say, very sentient animals. I mean, and I always point out these are animals you can, sometimes even, transplant their organs into humans, but we don't seem to have issue with it. Yeah, I have a lot of friends. In particular, I'm thinking of one friend who's a hardcore fisherman, Amy, and hunter. He's a meat guy, and he stopped eating octopus, and he's a chef with his own restaurant. I couldn't believe it. He has a dockside, seafood restaurant. The fact that he stopped eating octopus blew my mind, but I've been hearing that from more and more and more of my friends, and I love eating it so much, and I'm starting to wonder, but I'm headed to Hawaii again this winter, and I don't have plans not to eat octopus. I'll put it that way, but I am curious about the argument. I came and gave my talk there, and obviously I have a huge slant towards wild foods, and it's a big interest of mine. Of course, the challenge whenever that conversation comes up is the sustainability of it, both over time, but also per capita, I guess. So I'm just curious I'm curious what your thoughts are on wild foods as it relates to seafoods, given what you do and given the scale at which, when I'm talking about wild foods very often, let's say I'm talking about something like our fiddleheads in Maine in the spring. You've got some sustainability issues with that, but it's not like the culture is subsisting on that. Or if I'm talking about wild cranberries, it's like there's not a lot of pressure on the ecosystem. When we're talking about wild foods that come from the sea, wow, is there some enormous pressures, unrelenting pressures, and with the increases in our technology and our ability to harvest, the pressures have grown and grown and grown and grown. So, my position. I really love the idea of people eating wild food, but then I have such concerns about the sea and the scale at which it's happening, especially because if I'm going to eat wild cranberries, I'm going to go get them myself. But if I want to get wild seafood, I can just go purchase that, which takes all of the challenges out of it, which makes it very easy for people to get access to it, which means lots of people get to. So I'm curious how you feel about people eating so freely from the sea, and is this something you think? How do you see that playing out over the next century, let's say?
That's a minefield, so to speak. But let me give you my slant on things.
Okay.
We supposedly just reached the 8 billion mark in terms of our population.
We're there now, huh?
Yes.
Okay, stop saying
easily,
7+. That's what I always say.
easily by the end of this month, we're supposed to hit the 8 billion person mark, and then estimated by 2050 to 2060, we'll reach 10 billion.
Wow.
That's 2 billion in 30 years, 40 years time. And so that's an enormous amount of resources that's going to be needed to feed that growing population. And we think there's stresses now of overfishing on the commercial scale. You add another 20% to the population, that's even going to be worse. Wow. So yeah, I have the scale of commercial operations is unreal. I mean, they have to be efficient in order to make the money, right? So they use technology to do whatever is needed to collect as much and as fast as possible, whatever resources they're gathering. And I can taste the difference blindfolded between farm-raised Atlantic salmon and wild-caught Pacific salmon, hands down, no problem.
Yeah.
There's both a texture and a taste that is noticeably different. But I understand that the wild stocks are just being overtaxed. And Alaska is essentially at least in the United States, Alaska is the only place that's you're commercially harvesting salmon. There's some off the west coast of Washington and Oregon, but it's not anywhere like it used to be. And so you're moving, you're farming fish to alleviate the problem of capturing wild stocks. But then I've read also some estimates that say anywhere from 30 to 35% of the fish that are caught in the ocean are being turned around and processed into fish meal to turn into fish food for these farm raised fish. So yeah, it's kind of like, okay, we're doing farm raised fish in order to reduce the stress on the wild stocks, but you're feeding them wild fish. So
yeah,
it's catch-22, so to speak.
It's kind of hard to get around that, right?
Yeah.
Like one of the things with the Atlantic salmon you brought, you were mentioning the difference in the flavor. One of the concerns I have with Atlantic salmon, farmed Atlantic salmon, I mean, it's so marbled and fatty
Yes.
at a level that, it's like a grass-fed steak versus a corn-fed cow. And boy, when you start to cook it, that fat just starts rendering out. I'm guessing a lot, I don't really know much about it, but I have a sense that a lot of that is probably polyunsaturated fat, not the, or I shouldn't say that because marine oils are polyunsaturated. So I should say corn. I'm guessing that's like corn or something like that. I can't imagine that if that fat that's in an Atlantic salmon is coming from having eaten wild fish, then that's some oily fish being fed in huge concentrations. I mean, to get that level of body fat accumulation.
Yeah.
It's not natural. So that's kind of like really creepy to me to think about. But like nutritionally, it's different. It's not the same thing for our bodies when we eat it either,
Right. I mean, supposedly, salmon are rich in omega-3s. So whether farmed salmon have higher levels of omega-3 because they have a higher lipid content.
They have lower though. I don't think that it's omega-3. I want to say it's omega-6 fat like corn, but I guess I should do a little. I'll have to look back at that. It's been a while, but so where do you see this headed? Do you think that commercial fishing of the sea is going to be something that we have to phase out, or do you see this as, in the short term at least, do you see that there's just no way that's going to happen? I mean, so much of the population of the world's dependent on it, right? So this is something we're just going to keep doing for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I think
you're
so
much more tapped in than I am to.
Yeah, I think it will continue until the population ultimately collapses, just like the cod here in New England, right? You fish it down until it's not cost effective anymore, and then you switch to different organism, which is
eat our way down the ecosystem.
Yeah, which is unfortunate, but that's the way it is, being a top predator in the environment.
Eat the world, right?
Yeah.
What is the big picture for you? What is it outside of? I know when you teach, you're passing on so much, specific scientific data, but then what's the bigger picture motivator for you that gets you excited to teach? What are you really sharing?
Sharing. I hope to share the environment with the students, and that's really like you said in your talk, that you really don't understand the ecosystem until you spend time in it, and if you don't go there, if you just look at pictures and watch videos and watch documentaries, it's not the same. You have to experience it, and that's what I like to do by bringing students out to Washington or out all over the world. Sometimes we brought students to the Philippines to help us do research, and I got the travel bug early in life. As a kid, my parents moved around and traveled back and forth to the Philippines, and over the years, I've instilled that type of mindset to students. Travel while you can. Travel while you're young. Travel while you do not have responsibilities of having a family or a job. So the best time to do it is during college or summers and that sort of thing, and learn about other cultures, because the United States doesn't travel very much, at least the general population, and so they don't get to know and understand other people's perspectives. And we're a society that likes to consume a lot. Like, you got to have the latest phone.
Sure do.
Really? You really need the latest phone when the next model comes out? Or do you need to have that latest car, because people like to buy cars every 2 or 3 years or change them out when their lease options is up? And that's a big demand on resources. When there's a demand for those things, then companies are going to provide it. And so, but you go to other countries where they don't have these demands, and they're leading a simple life, and they're happy, and they're subsistence living on the land and in the fishing. They're just feeding their family or getting enough to sell to make enough money just to get by. And so, whereas Westerners, acquiring of wealth is the epitome of success, right? And it's a philosophical thing for me. I try and bring students out and say, look, you don't need all these things to be happy.
Alan, thank you for sharing that, and I appreciate you going into the philosophical a little bit there. Thank you so much for your time today, man. It's been a real pleasure talking to you, and I really enjoyed meeting you.
Thanks for listening to the WildFed podcast. You can help us grow this show by subscribing and leaving us a rating and review. It ensures better rankings and more advertiser interest, which translates directly into better shows, more awesome guests, and a constant stream of fresh new content. Have a podcast guest or topic suggestion, or maybe a hunting, fishing, or foraging trip you'd like to host the WildFed TV show for? email us at info@wild-fed.com. If you still haven't seen season 1 or 2 of the WildFed TV show, go to myoutdoortv.com, grab yourself a free trial subscription, and then check out all 20 episodes. Season 3 of WildFed premieres on Outdoor Channel in early 2023. And be sure to visit our website, wild-fed.com, to check out our store for WildFed shirts, hoodies, hats, stickers, and more. WildFed. Food is all around you.